some comments from developers over the years about why they target 30 FPS for some games, which typically doesn't super apply to PC. It's more on the console side of things, like, for example, Starfield only offering a 30 FPS mode. I think games like Gotham Knights, there was sort of a controversy around that being one of the newer or first examples of a PS5/Xbox Series X game that only offered a 30 FPS mode. I think maybe they later updated it to include 60. I can't quite remember. But basically, there was sort of this, a lot of games were coming out on console, launched with 60 FPS modes, and then there was this slow backwards step towards 30 FPS. And a lot of the discussion there was around, well, I'm a developer, so I want to include more graphical features. I want the game to do more. Therefore, the compromise for that is 30 FPS. Like, we can't integrate all these features into our game, largely graphical features, and run it at 60 FPS. Like, the consoles just aren't possible to do that. And there even are some CPU limitations which can come across to PC gaming as well, where they've targeted 30 FPS on the console CPUs, and then that really does limit, what you can achieve on a higher performance PC because the CPU isn't that much more powerful. So, and I typically disagree with those opinions. I think a lot of what's lost in that discussion about we're increasing the visuals and in doing so reducing the performance from 60 to 30 FPS ignores that reducing the FPS from 60 to 30 reduces your visual quality.
Mm-hmm.
A lot of people, some developers, some gamers seem to have this thought that by running it at 30 or 60 FPS, the quality of the game is the same. Like, the visual quality is the same at the same settings, just your performance is higher. And having now tested displays in depth and looking at exactly how they work and how they display frames to you, it's very clear that running games at a higher frame rate increases the visual quality. It's not just performance. It's not just
kidding.
Lower latency. It's less blurry. And the simple reality is that, these days, back in the CRT days, it was a little different because they were impulse displays. So they would display each frame very quickly and then fade away to black before the next frame was ready. And when you impulse a display like that, you typically only see it for a brief period, which makes it look very clear, but not necessarily smooth. So obviously running 30 FPS on a CRT, it's still not very smooth. Like, it's slideshowy, but you're seeing each frame very clearly because it's being just flashed very briefly. Whereas LCDs and OLEDs these days are sample and hold monitors where each frame is shown on screen for the entire period up until the next frame is ready, unless you're using backlight strobing modes. And what that means is, as you're looking around the screen and things at motion, your eyes are moving where objects on screen are not moving. And that creates blur. And that's where a lot of people see motion blur and see, just even with motion blur disabled, the screen looks blurry at like a 30 hertz or 60 hertz experience. And the higher and higher your frame rate and refresh rate goes, up to 120, 240, I've just been testing a 500 hertz monitor, it becomes a lot clearer. And that's clearly a visual improvement that you're getting. In games, for example, even a single player game, you're moving around the screen and there's, billboards with nice, beautiful text and graphics on them. And as you're trying to track them in motion on a 30 FPS display, that looks really blurry. Like, even with motion blur disabled, very blurry. You turn on motion blur, it's like amplifying how blurry it looks.
Well, I'm laughing at you talking about how blurry it looks at 30 hertz because it's just laughable. Because what was that demo from the Asus booth at Computex? It was like, was it 540 hertz, something like that? What was that comparing with? It was like 360 or something, wasn't it? Was it 240?
I think it was a lot lower. Maybe it was 120. Maybe.
Was it whatever it was more of a standard high refresh rate, whether it was 144. I don't know. I remember it being, I thought it was quite a high refresh rate.
But it wasn't 60. No, it wasn't 60 or 30.
No, definitely wasn't 60. No, that would be, no, I think it was, let's just say 144 because it was at least that, I believe, but we could go back and find out. And then it was 5 something.
Yeah, 540.
I think it was 540, from memory. And the difference with them side by side, was it like the Blowbusters test or something like that was running? It was a CSGO, wasn't it? It was a CSGO.
I think it was like they'd taken the idea of the Blowbusters UFO test and they had turned it into a more gamified version.
Yeah, it was like a CSGO themed thing or something. Anyway, it was like, high refresh rate to extreme high refresh rate. And looking at them side by side, it was day and night, the clarity. Like the 540 hertz looked insane. Like it was amazing. The image quality was really good. The motion
And I've got
was
that
just
monitor now, and let me tell you, it's good.
Yeah, I want it. I want it because it looked amazing. And that's from like 144 to 540, and the difference was insane. From that demo anyway, I'd love to get my hands on it and have a play with it.
Mm-hmm.
So I mean, from 30 hertz to 120, 144, whatever. Like the difference is just insane. Like you're doing you're playing it. You might as well be playing a different game. It's that different. Like I can't stress enough.
A lot of people struggle to test this, but I find a really good way to test this if you do have a monitor and you are interested in testing this is go find the utility out there called Smooth Frog. And in this utility, which is very much for testing monitors, and you're running your monitor in a variable refresh rate state, so make sure that's enabled. It basically is like the Blurbuster's UFO test where it moves objects across the screen that look like frogs, but it's got this slider, an FPS slider that you can very easily change from like 30 to 60 to 120 or whatever. If you're on a high refresh rate monitor, in that utility, start lowering the refresh rate and keeping the motion the same. So the frogs will move across the screen at the same rate, but just your FPS and refresh rate will get lower. And you will very clearly notice how much blurrier the image gets once your monitor is running in that sort of 30 to 60 hertz range, as opposed to more like 144 or 120 hertz. You will very clearly see how much clearer and nicer the higher refresh rate experience is. And I think that's a really great way to sort of experience what that looks like. Because often in games, you're moving around, you're trying to get a feel for it, and sort of, it's better, but you don't quite know how or why. And there isn't often that really easy way to just take your game from running at 120 FPS one moment to 30 FPS on another moment, so you can clearly examine the differences. Whereas this utility makes that very easy. I think once people see that sort of difference and have tested it for themselves, they'll sort of get what I'm saying when I say that there is a significant visual difference between 60 and 30 FPS. You can't just say like, oh, we're turning on so many more graphical effects at 30 FPS, and that makes the game look better, when at the same time turning from 60 to 30 FPS makes the game look worse. Like it's that balancing act of how much better are the graphics in the game? Is that enough to counteract the fact that the clarity of the game is worse, and the smoothness, which is sort of a visual effect as well, how much worse you're making it by making that decision? I think a lot of the time, especially today with games that can run pretty good quality rasterization effects, the balance is skewed pretty heavily into often those 30 FPS modes on console only have minor to moderate visual improvements, but the blurriness is a lot higher. So there's big question marks there as to whether that trade-off has been worth it. Is it worth just making your game look a little bit worse in terms of like the sharpness of the shadows or how accurate the reflections are? Is it worth it just making those a tad worse to get the significantly higher clarity of a 60 FPS experience? And I think most of the time, yes, it is worth put it into 60 FPS.